So you have that. Put the sound on.
La la la. Test, test.
Ok, merci, ça marche. Très bien chez moi. Je reste appuyé quelques secondes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, can I bring you back from the break then? Ready for our second of two debates that we wanted to hold today. So we set a frame at the beginning with Ron Haug bringing the Norsk Hydro and Eurometaux perspective. More with an application focus there, but not only on our first panel debate, looking at the battery issue. Can Europe lead on batteries? 50% of you were unsure about that at the start. I might poll you at the end of today and see if views have changed. We'll see. But now we come to our second panel, which will take us through broadly to the end of today, with one exception, that we'll also have a closing keynote bringing it all together. If you remember, I said 5 stages. So we're here now looking at this idea of breaking silos. I was going to have 3 hammers on the stage. You can picture them maybe. I was going to have a little one that you'd use for the little nuts, you know, at Christmas. You know the one I mean, right? And I was going to pick that up and go, is this the size of recycled and very low-carbon European-produced metal we need to break silos of policy? Then I was going to pick up my normal hammer I use at home for putting nails in the wall. And then I was going to pick up my sledgehammer, because I think some of you might think we need one of those. But unfortunately, we weren't able to source those recycled metals in time. Oh, well, never mind, that tells me something. I should have phoned the Chinese. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I joke. So our panel then is what meaningful. Ron Haug used this word at the beginning. Meaningful actions. Not what actions, but what meaningful, concrete, real, actionable things do we need to break the silo we have to a degree in policy between circular economy and low carbon. They're managed by different parts of the institutions. They collaborate. But as industry, many of you know that there's not a full alignment yet, even if there's will to have a better one. So how are we going to do this panel? Well, a little bit like the last one, but with a little twist this time to get you through to the end of our day together. So 5 stages, as you can see. We're going to start off with 5 big ideas. A consortium made a very, what I think, because I've read it, interesting report with 5 very concrete recommendations on how to break the silo between climate energy policy and circular economy in a win-win way for the benefit of industry and for the benefit of European citizens and society at large. And we're going to start off with that person showing us, with a few slides in about 5 or 6 minutes, the main outputs of that lengthy and robust report. We'll then bring our panel together, and like we did last time, we'll have short statements from our panelists only, so we can make time for debate. Then you, the audience, again, you come back in. This time we're not using Slido. As we build momentum as the day goes on, I just want people standing up with microphones, if you don't mind. So we'll come to you quickly today in this debate for you to pose your questions. We'll have 3 microphones around the room coming to you as quick as we can. And then our panel will be looking at short-term priorities. We'll come back to you again for more questions. So we're going to go long-term with the first statements, vision if you like, and then concrete actions next. So that's enough from me. That's how we're going to do it. So no Slido this time. You can focus on the debate. So I'm going to call up to the stage now the first of our speakers, as I said. You might want to note this, the report that you're going to hear the 5 ideas from. It's the policy levers for a low-carbon circular economy. And Jelmer Husgaard, was one of the authors and leaders on this report. So now I'm going to hand over to you, if you want to take the stage, and show us what you've got with your 5 ideas, please. Could we give him a round of applause?
Thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction. Also, thank you for having me. I'm Jelmer Husgaard from Shifting Paradigms, which is an organization which uses metabolic or systems approaches to identify circular low-carbon mitigation opportunities, both in Europe and in developing countries. And I'm also an associate with Circular Economy, and the Policy Levers report was written with them. What you see here on the slide, which is this one, are some of the organizations that we work with. And the report that David just referred to is the one on the left, Policy Levers for a Low-Carbon Circular Economy, funded by the European Climate Foundation. In the middle is an assessment of some more international perspective on circular economy and climate change, and on the right, the global state or the state of the world in terms of its circularity. A report launched last year. Let me first go through a number of figures, just to explain the relation between the circular economy and climate change. Because basically, when using the circular economy as a greenhouse gas mitigation lever, what we're actually doing is tapping into the 16 gigatons gap that there currently is between all the national commitments, all the pledges made under the UNFCCC, and a 1.5 degree scenario. In other words, the circular economy is not yet in these pledges. So the 16 gigatons gap is exactly what the circular economy is targeting. And it's doing that by focusing on the 67% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which are actually related to management of materials, not so much related to personal passenger transport or thermal comfort, but really to the way we manage materials. It's also tapping into, going more to a European perspective, to the 56% reduction in EU greenhouse gas emissions, which is possible with demand-side measures in 4 industries, a recent assessment by Material Economics. And finally, it's also addressing the issue which the EU is facing, which is that although the EU has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions with 20%, if you look at all the value chains that serve European markets, we're actually looking at an increase. And also that is exactly what the circular economy is targeting. This is a complex Sankey, probably difficult to read from a distance, but I'll just explain the basis. What you see on the left are the materials that we annually extract. And on the top you have the minerals, orange are the metals, and the fossil fuels and biomass. And on the far right, going through the full value chain, you see which societal needs they satisfy, which are, again, from top to bottom, you have housing and infrastructure, then there's communication, a small one, and the big red one is mobility. And at the bottom, green, you have nutrition. And what it basically tells us, if you look at metals, metals typically serve societal needs related to the construction sector and mobility. What is also important to note is that at the bottom you see one loop going back, so there was the assessment of how circular the world is, but a large share of what is being recycled are actually metals, which already tells us that in a circular world, metals will play a very important role. Then back to Europe, and also the policy perspective. This is from the actual report referenced by David, and what you see here are the green, which is sort of a timeline of policies and how policies are building up environmental policies in Europe. And what you see, the green one are the climate and energy policies, and the blue ones are the circular economy policies. And they are very much separated, although they are closely interrelated. In the policymaking process, they're very much separated. And there's a big opportunity to actually bring these two more together and also thereby develop the circular economy mitigation potential. To make that concrete, five ways to do that. The first is, or let me just say like five suggestions on how to bring both circular economy policies and climate change policies together, but also improve circular economy policies further. And the first would be to encourage circular low carbon procurement, which essentially is to tap into the general procurement or the total procurement power of the European Union and its member states to stimulate demand for circular products. Second one would be more of an international perspective to promote the circular economy under the Paris Agreement, and essentially in 2 ways. One is to make sure that the circular economy is an important mitigation lever in our national communication, so in our communication internationally and what the EU will do, but also what other countries will do. And secondly, also using Article 6 on international cooperation as a way to make better use of circular economy strategies which tap into the mitigation potential all the way down supply chains across countries. Third one, to expand the eco-design directive to material efficiency. It's a directive which has done a lot of work on energy efficiency, and we now need to also harness its full potential in the circular economy. Fourth one, to improve extended producer responsibility. Amongst the people that we interviewed for this report, some of the critique was that it is a good policy measure, but it's not making sure that we actually retain most of the value at the end of its life. So there's a lot of still material value being lost in the recycling processes, even if they are promoted by EPR schemes. And the final one is to align the tax regime, which is essentially a call to essentially improve the business case for circular economy strategies, which tend to be very labor intensive, particularly if you talk about reverse logistics, disassembling of materials, circular design. There's a lot of labor and also human talent involved. And the call here is literally to reduce the cost on labor and make that financially possible by having higher taxes and levies on the use of natural resources, whether they're water, fossil fuels, or emissions, could be CO2, NOx, or even waste. So it's essentially a shift of the tax revenue from labor onto the use of natural resources and waste. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jelmer. So 5 clear and concrete things there for us. Now, just before I bring up the rest of our panel to the stage, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask you 2 questions. You're going to need to use your hands. You might want to start warming up a little bit to get them up here. So we've got 5 things. Encourage circular low-carbon procurement. Promote the circular economy under the Paris Agreement, as we heard. Expand the Eco-Design Directive to material efficiency. We heard a little bit about that before. Improve the extended product responsibility and align the tax regime. Number 5 is always an interesting one. What I want to ask you first is to show me a hand. I'm going to go through them one by one. And I want to ask you what you think is priority here. Because these are 5 evidence-based recommendations. But what do you as an audience see as priority? Because we'll discuss that first. So let's take the first one, the idea of encouraging circular low-carbon procurement. Who sees that as a priority step in helping bridge this gap between circularity and low-carbon strategy and ambition? Raise a hand if you see it as being one. Okay, that's a no. All right, great. What about the second one? Promoting the circular economy under the auspices of the Paris Agreement. So it's a mitigation lever in wider national and international commitments. Anybody see that as a key step we could take? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Some of you, okay, we're warming up. The Eco-Design Directive to material efficiency. So circular design. Raise a hand if you think that. Okay, we've got, okay, I think about 10, 15% of our room there. And then coming to aligning the tax regime.
No, there's one more.
Oh, excuse me. Improve extended producer responsibility. How could I jump that one? Yep, okay, again, I think about 25% of our room. And last but not least, align the tax regime. Okay, so we've got a mix amongst these, an interesting level of different views. Now raise a hand if you've got one that's not in here. You've got another idea that you think would be a real game-changing gap filler, if you like. Because if you have, keep the thought, because you can bring it later. Anyway, with that in mind, let's get our panel going then. So I'd like to call up the rest of our panelists, please. So we've got Joe Rogers, Senior Vice President of Technology at Arubis. Again, as usual, can we give them a round of applause when they come up, please? We've got Yves Tam, Councillor for Environmental Affairs at the Estonian Permanent Representation to the EU. And last but by no means least, we've got Reinhard Bütikofer, MEP, from the Green Group and a member of the ITRE Committee. Right, so we've heard from Jelmer already. So now I'd like to go around and hear from each of you. We've heard his idea of vision in the long term to try and break down the circular economy, low-carbon policy silos. So I'll bring each of you in now for your statements too. Joe, would you like to kick us off? Reinhard, you can go next, and I'll come over to you, Yves, at the end.
Okay, so I'm representing here Arubis, and most of us know us as a copper company, but I want to make clear that we are in fact a multi-metal company. Huh? We have about 50% of our raw material is coming already from recycling, so we have some long-lasting experience already in the recycling of non-ferrous metals. Huh? I would like to make 4 statements, and the first one is about investment climate. It was not particularly addressed here, but recycling material is something that needs state-of-the-art sustainable processing. But it also needs proper steering with standards and guidelines throughout the complete value chain. And that was already mentioned a few times. For example, Aurubis is planning to invest more than 500 million euros in the coming years in innovative, complex metallurgical installations, focusing on the recycling and the treatment of complex raw materials, of course, thereby respecting the highest environmental standards. But it goes without saying that that is only possible if there is a strong and a consistent political commitment to a circular economy. Point two, we believe that our European value chains for raw materials are already the most sustainable in the world. And we find it horrible to see that still quite a lot of our recycling materials are leaving our continent, being shipped away to regions where they are treated with much lower environmental standards and energy standards. Third point, along its production cycle, the non-ferrous metals industry produces large quantities of different elements. A lot of it is very sexy, very attractive, and we touched it already in one of the applications, but we also have drawbacks. One of them, for instance, being the iron silicate aggregates, our final slags in our process, which we use today in construction applications. I can guarantee you that we are doing, as an industry, our utmost best in order to continuously explore if we can push further down the metal content in these slags. But the regulation must guarantee the continued safe use of these final slags, for instance, again, in construction applications. It is clear that our industry is key for innovation. It is key for more sustainability, for innovation and technological progress in Europe. As an example, of course, copper as an electrical conductor is crucial for the energy transition into renewable energy, and energy increases efficiency, and thus climate protection. We touched this morning the issue of the battery, but we should not forget that there is much more into an electrical vehicle, like electrical motors, where we still believe that a lot also can be done with new designs, new materials, and, for instance, excluding the use of rare earth metals. So I really think that our industry and the recycling in general is key to serve innovation in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Reinhard, I'll pass straight on to you.
Well, thanks first of all to Eurometaux for having me back. This is a very timely topic, but some of you know from earlier events, when you invite a politician, you are running the risks that he's not only going to talk about policy, but also about politics. And I will do that here because I believe that to break down silos, both managerial and technology silos, also has some political preconditions in breaking down political silos. You cannot have a real breakthrough without rearranging the field of actors in a more productive way. And this conference is an example of doing so, but more widely speaking, I think we're clearly not where we should be. Giving you an actual example, I'm presently part of the negotiations within the work of ITRE on the European Defence Fund. Now, recyclability could and should play a huge role in that sector of defense, just as in any industrial sector. We have 39 different raw materials going into that defense sector, 17 of which are critical. The recycling rate is minimal, but with regard to jet engines, industry has managed to increase the level of recycling to almost 60%, and there are plans of doing more. But in the discussions within ITRE over the European Defence Fund, recycling is not a topic. So this is about sort of breaking political silos and also about breaking political silos between different types of actors. Traditionally, I would say that there used to be this setup, this political setup with industry on one side and environmentalists and proponents of circular economy on the other, and the regulators and the politicians were the bridge builders, trying to make either sort of agree to enough concessions to find a way forward. I think the picture is changing. And today, on the basis of what everybody agreed to in Paris, I see a much bigger opportunity for bringing industry and environmentalists much more closely together as natural allies. And in some cases, I see today the regulator and the politician as a builder of walls instead of bridges. So I think we have to take account of this new assortment and this new, the implied new opportunities to break political silos, and that implies also that in every sector involved, we have to stop letting the laziest, at least intellectually laziest participant define the level of progress. If I discuss with our Rubis, I think it will be very easy to agree in many cases on specific goals that we have to go for. If I talk to the non-ferrous metal sector, it will be more difficult. When I talk to Business Europe, it will be almost impossible to move forward. And the same applies in the political sector. If you talk to me, it might be easier for you. If you talk to my Fundi colleague, it might be more difficult. If I have to agree with him, then it will be very hard on you. We need alliances of progressive forces from all the sectors instead of sectoral silos where always the slowest actor defines the speed that we project.
Okay. Yeah. Clear. So, meaningful action, then big picture for you really is a question of a little bit rewriting the way things may have been before and really shifting, using the political way to break the silos. So I think by being political, you've done us all a service here. Thank you very much, Reinhard. Right, I'll pass over to you now, Eve, since we've already heard from Jelmer, and you tell us your long-term views on this idea of breaking silos from the member state point of view.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon already. Yes, everyone. Mm-hmm. I'll be sharing views indeed from member states' perspective, so it's a bit different than what you heard now from the industry and the parliament. And my plan was actually to talk a lot about the triangle of low carbon economy, circular economy, and sustainable financing. But as I saw in the previous session, that you already went quite far into that, and you are already well informed of the opportunities there. So I'll just say that I think the overview of the report that we just now got from Jelmer was very concise and very clear. The menu of options that we saw there in the end, I think we are not going to pick and choose. We'll need to do a lot on many of those fields. And indeed, moving to low carbon economy, as you said, develops the circular economy mitigation potential. So it's moving it forward. And the thinking we do on member state level is obviously we need to have that long-term vision where we want to go, and we want to make sure that all these investment decisions or policy decisions or measures that we're going to implement are then evaluated against that long-term decision. So we don't make these policy decisions based on election cycles, be it on member states or in different EU institutions, so making sure that it's constantly carrying onwards. And one specific idea that I wanted to share with you, because it's a bit different than what normally comes up, is our thinking of how it would improve the whole implementation of these kind of long-term goals if we give more independence and involvement to local regions and municipalities, because you can imagine there are municipalities where a lot of income comes from tourism. There are others where there, let's say, are big mines, or others where you have, for example, lots of different industry that could benefit from industrial symbiosis. So involving those local municipalities in asking them where they currently are, comparing to the vision of where we want to go, and we'll need to see, for example, in 2050, whether we talk about a CO2 reduction of 80%, 95%, or net zero emissions. Well, we don't know yet. But basically letting them evaluate where they are, and then letting them suggest how they can actually get us where we need to get. So this kind of top-down and bottom-up approach is something that we see could be very, very useful going forward, because obviously there are many challenges ahead, and we all need to work together. So I think, yeah, I'll stop here for the introductory parts.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask a question to several of you, in fact. It's a little bit of a parallel to the old mobile phone question from our first panel. I know that Estonia, in a number of ways as a member state, is incredibly progressive. You have 100% e-government now, if I'm not wrong, already. On digitalization, you are way ahead of the European average, from what I remember. Am I correct?
You are correct.
Okay, great. So when it comes to this idea, then, of driving towards a 2050 low-carbon Europe, looking at it, balancing it with competitiveness, balancing it with societal good and need, are you also progressive on that?
Well, using information technology, using data, is something that we are indeed very keen on. There's one specific element that I wanted to touch upon today that relates specifically to that question, and it's regarding recycling and knowing the content in the products. So you know, what kind of substances they are there in products or materials, and based on that, whether you can recycle them or not, and how would it then in the future impact products made from secondary raw materials. So if countries would be you know, collecting that data and putting it out there openly for all the producers to have this, to use it, and to innovate based on that, I mean, you can do so much with data. Even having air quality data available for everyone, you can develop new products for consumers, knowing how is air quality in that region. So being more open regarding sharing the data with everyone is something that we are very keen on. We are constantly working on this. We also worked on this during our presidency last year. So definitely we are continuing to push on this.
Interesting. So I pick up on your idea of bottom-up then, empowering and involving localities and regions rather than a more top-down national approach, but also the value and potential value of big data for governments and regional authorities to be able to help facilitate higher recycling rates as well. Okay, I'm with you. Okay, great. I'll come straight back to you. You've heard 3 other points of view here to the one you put forward as well. Any reflections?
Also on the voting, indeed, low carbon procurement was not one of the favorites in the Paris agreements, but I think also the rating got higher the further down we moved. I'm very curious also to hear people's views on the extended user responsibility, which I think had most support. But I fully agree with the views related to the combination of bottom-up and top-down approaches. We also, I think the work that I'm doing with circular economy is also a constant search of what is the right scale, where do you have enough volume, but also still a size that you can still understand and comprehend when it comes to mapping out resource flows and identifying opportunities. And I think in terms of data sharing, I think in essence a circular economy is also very much a collaborative economy where any data is shared, where the materials in a certain product are mapped out, they are designed in a way that also at the end of the lifetime they can be disassembled. And this all requires data sharing and information sharing. I think that's very much a direction we need to move into.
So then we'd have a situation where it's easier to recycle more and products are better designed and created here in Europe with a lower carbon footprint. So that's one way, arguably, of connecting these two things up. You mentioned the procurement part. I wanted to ask, so from the report that you worked on, that you created together in a consortium, I know it's one of your elements in there. Perhaps it's my ignorance, but how many member states, if we go for 28 as it currently stands, okay, not 27, how many, I couldn't help it, sorry.
We're sorry for you.
You know, I'm sorry for me as well, okay? Anyway, are there any member states actively using this? I mean, what's the proportion? Because it strikes me, excuse me, I'm a layman. I'm a scientist, I'm a trained science teacher. I'm broadly familiar with the topic areas in your industry, as many of you know. But I'm just absolutely shocked by the fact that at Brussels we can have political level debates about this and this, circular economy, bioeconomy, low carbon. I sell services to the European institutions as a professional. And if they don't have, and they don't have fully built into their full procurement system, a demand that the things they buy tick the boxes they're asking the rest of the world to tick, I see an inherent contradiction here. Maybe it's just me being silly, but it strikes me as bizarre, if not hypocritical. What do you think? I mean, what's the state of play with this? How does it work? I don't get it.
I think there's I mean, I know from experience the situation in the Netherlands best, and what I see there is that governments, from the national government to municipalities, are very actively trying to integrate circular economy principles in their procurement process, which is very much a different mindset. It's very much a collaborative process where you very early in the procurement stage you integrate with potential suppliers and you try to understand what is out there in the market, whether a product needs to be a product, whether it can be a service, and that is. Always a struggle also with procurement regulations, the legal side of that. But I think it's very important that we explore the potential there, and that's exactly what I think many municipalities and also the Dutch government is trying to do.
So the Netherlands is one example then of a country that's moving forward strongly with that, but take it on an EU level.
To be honest, I wouldn't know how other European member states are picking that up, or I'm sure that there's similar examples.
I'd be interested to find out myself.
Yeah. Just don't have that overview.
I'd be very interested. Okay, good stuff. Right, I think at this stage I want to do two things. The first one is say thank you for your initial comments, everybody, and the second one is ask our audience if there's anything they want to ask at this stage to our panelists. Any questions here? Show me a hand if you've got one, and I'll do what I normally do and collect. There's one right bang in the middle. Can we get a microphone over here, please? Okay, noted. So in the middle, and then afterwards to the gentleman at the back. If you're going, could you, for this stage, since we're just using microphones, everybody, could you state your name and your organisation? And if your question is for a specific member of our panel, could you nominate them? But if it's for the whole panel, could you tell us, please? Okay, thanks.
Hello, Victor Dries. I'm working for Minister Homans, region of Flanders. I very much like the idea of having a progressive alliance, not only with politicians, but also companies giving a global progressive message to our politicians, to us, but also on, for instance, the example of the procurement. It often says governments must buy greener, must buy sustainable. How many of you guys are having a circular market today? How many of you have got a circular procurement? If you together, a number of the progressive industry players, say they want to buy circular, your market is bigger than ours.
Okay, point is noted. Any reflections on that from our panelists?
Well, if I look at what we see in the front of our doors, I can guarantee you that we are still far away from a circular or design of installations and stuff like that. So there's still a lot of way to go. And that's really not yet embedded in what we are doing at the end of the day. So I take that point. We're also very teased with the silo thinking, because that is also something typically we want to break silos down in our company. And then I was reflecting about how could it look like, such a thing? And I was just wondering, we have windmills on our side where we allow the community to invest in. So they are partners in that. We have rest heat, which we are pumping more and more into the city. So we are connecting our remaining heat at the end of the day to the city. Our tank houses are becoming a part of a modulation of the electricity network. Is that the kind of typical activities you see as a coalition of the willing, or is there something else?
Just following suit to what you just said, I recall that a couple of years ago I tried to build in the German context what I proposed to call a resource efficiency alliance. And I wanted to bring together actors from industry, from research, from NGOs, and from policymakers and regulators. And I convinced a former CEO of your company to chair the whole thing, until his colleagues from the sector convinced him that it was too dangerous to do that, and it all fell flat. So there have been efforts in the past, and maybe we should try to do similar things
Again.
Now. Regarding the question of mobilizing the force of industry, I just wanted to give you an impression that I had yesterday in a discussion with the German machine tool industry in a different context. There one panelist said, look, we as representatives of industry, we represent the micro perspective. We look after our companies and the balance sheet for the next quarter or this year. And you, the politicians, have to do the macro stuff. Well, if that's the mindset, we'll never get together. Because we have to, as politicians, have to watch out for your balance sheet in a way, indirectly, because if we kill you, there will not be a thriving economy. On the other hand, if industry doesn't also accept and acknowledge the responsibility to be in the long-term game, we will not succeed. So I think it's very much an issue of the mindset.
Okay. We had a question over here as well. Can we get the mic over there, please? And then noted and noted. Okay.
I'm still Patrick van den Bosch from Agoria with the mobile phones. I can echo what I like also, like Victor, who I know, the idea of a coalition of the willing. I do like that. But my question is more related to the execution of whether it's ambitious or not EU policy. Well, what I do see is that, take for instance the waste shipment regulation. There is an evaluation ongoing, and what do we see? The non-harmonized implementation in the member states are in fact the main blocking element. So we not only have silos at European level, but we have clear silos at national level or even regional level, which are hindering the circular economy, which are hindering, I would say, the progress to a low carbon economy. How can we solve that? Because that's really a very difficult issue.
I see a reflective smile, ladies and gentlemen, on the face of a former climate commissioner in the front row when he hears about, environment, my apologies. Would you like to comment on that? Oh, yeah. Can we get a microphone over here, please? And then I'll give it back to the panel, okay?
Good day, everybody. Actually, I would like to comment on it, but by the way, everything what you talked about, it was in my drawer and proposed, but it didn't go through. And everything was meant to be done, and in particular the question which was now asked, the regulation on aligning inspection services among member states was ready, but it couldn't pass the Commission because I was not allowed to put it on the table. It was ready from a simple reason, because I firmly believed that if you don't align the inspections, then of course all the countries which don't trust each other, by the way, by definition, are coming sidelined, and also NGOs, the same, are coming to Brussels directly. Instead, they would go to their own courts and clear up the table. And that's still the problem. And until we will have that kind of situation, we will have the problem. And it's unfortunate that even I could tell you the whole story, how actually circular economy arrived on the table and how it was later removed. But it arrived on the table exactly from the reason which you explained, because I was able to 3 years work behind the stage with all stakeholders, which then get pissed off when it was removed. And that was the only reason that in 2 years it turned from environmental package to a real economic package with good environmental consequences. But it's a hard political game. And it's really, I know exactly whom European Commission it's listening. And if you don't create in business sector alliances which will have the impact more seriously in the Commission than currently the business associations which are considered as those who represent your voice, but actually they don't represent your voice. They represent the voice of the laggers. And that needs to change because the Commission, it's a political body, it's listening to those too much and not enough to you. And wake up, kick their asses.
Right, Yanis, thank you very much. We'll hold that there. Reinhard, you wanted to come in there, you said as well.
I agree with the Commissioner, but I would like to add another dimension to that. I think there's also a bottom-up way in this regard. And I pick up the example of WEEE. A couple of years ago, we cooperated with the Port Authority of Antwerp to look into ways of being more effective. Antwerp has been taking the lead. Other harbors, not that much. I tried to enact a similar initiative in Hamburg, and I failed. I would speculate and risk a bet with everyone in the room if our Rubis, who are based in Hamburg, get together with a couple of other industrial actors telling the Port Authority and the government, the local government in Hamburg, that they want their Port Authority to live up to the standard, at least of Antwerp, that could be done. And it would create a favorable environment for the regulation that the Commissioner talked about.
Okay, thanks. Right, we had a question here in the middle as well that was pending, and then one over there. This way, down here, please.
Okay, thank you, Ranaug from Hydro. I just want to bring in the element of simplification versus smart regulation. Because I liked very much what you said about having this alliance of progressive industry. But I also want to remind them about having benchmark, good benchmarks in the policy regulation. Because there is a risk that we go into the trap that want to have simplified policy instead of having benchmarks and regulation that really incentivize the best investments and the best technology in Europe. So I just want, it's a comment, but it's also a question, well, how do we see that? Because there is for sure a drive for simplification of regulation, and that I can understand. But we are also a very advanced society, and we are a very advanced industry has become. So that means that regulation also has to be quite detailed and smart.
Okay, I'll come. Does anyone else want to pick up on that as well? Because obviously you've got your views on this one from a member state and a recent presidency perspective as well. What's your view on simplification versus smart regulation in this sense?
Well, as I'm now talking clearly on behalf of Estonia, well, we are always for simplification because we are a small administration, and it's always this trade-off of making things simple but efficient enough. But what I can say is that it's just always you need to look at both aspects and try to find a way that it makes most sense for the specific situation that you're trying to solve. Yeah, that's literally all I can say.
So for you, it's striking the balance.
Yeah.
What would you mention on that?
For me, we were more called to really go back to the essence. So why is it that certain circular business models are simply not possible because they're not feasible? I think that very often that gets back to the price of resources, the price of labor, and I think it's with sort of these fundamental levers that we should change, or even the price of CO2. And I think with that you have sort of something that's relatively less complex, but I think an impact across your full economy.
Okay, Reinhard?
Albert Einstein once said, make it as simple as possible, but not more. And I think that applies. You have to measure the simplicity of the process against the goal. And if making it more simple ruins your goal, you are not getting to where you want to get. I believe that if we would be able to rely more on market-based instruments like CO2 pricing, then we would not need to rely as much on regulation, because then the flexibility would produce better solutions in the marketplace. So that's would always be my first option. It doesn't obviously apply everywhere. And regarding your benchmarking remark, I know that big companies like BASF are very much in favor of that. So you are not standing alone there. And I think it's a meaningful and a very sensible approach.
Okay. And Jo, you got some?
Well, I think we have different level of specification and guidance. I think specifications can work marvelously, and we see that in many environments. Try to build electrical cabinets; they are specified like hell, but similar everywhere in Europe, and it works. There is no problem with that. But if we talk about more guidance, then I agree. Then we should find the right leverage there. Huh? Is it regulation or is it pricing at the end of the day? So for technical aspects, I would go for technical specification. There is no problem with that. If it is more a long-term steering, then it's about finding the right lever there in order to change the mentality at the end of the day.
Okay. Right, back to our audience. We had a question over here, yeah?
Hello? Okay. Magdalena Garczyńska, European Aluminium. My question is as follows. If we want the low carbon policy work, we need to have the circular economy rightly implemented. And one of the critical issues in circular economy is the fact that we are continuously losing the resources, and there is a lot of scrap, metal scrap, going outside of Europe that could be perfectly recycled in Europe. And we are losing this material. We don't know which standards are applied when, and if this scrap is actually recycled. So my question is, what actions Europe should undertake or is prepared to undertake, and if there are debates already to tackle this issue? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. Well, Jo, this is something you touched upon before about material going out of Europe. Do you want to pick up on that one first?
Well, I mean, in practice, it is what we have witnessed throughout many years, that you see this flooding out of raw materials. So it's still ongoing as we speak, which is of course, a bit sad looking at the whole topic that we are addressing today. And if you look behind it, the dynamics behind that, it is to some extent environmental, and that is also for us sometimes a problem, let that be no doubt. But a lot of that is strategic, and we are talking about the Chinese that have been in our market for many, many, many years, but they have moved on, and that is clear. So you see there's something changed in China, and the mentality is setting there. That being said, I think Europe should really close its border at the end of the day for getting out of those materials and take care of ourselves for availability of the material, but also for good reason, environmental protection in general.
I'm with you, but our question, I think, and I like the subtlety myself in the question from a communications point of view. What should we do, but what can we do? So you're saying there what we should do, which is just enforce that stays in Europe. And I think many would agree with that. But is that something that feasibly we can do in a political way?
I think so, because what is leading to this exit of material is a matter of pricing. People can manipulate easily pricing strategies, and that is exactly what was addressed here, and squeeze it out. And that's something that the industry not really has in its hands.
Okay, so that's over to the policymakers. Industry can't action that one.
Well, when the rare earth crisis erupted 8 years ago, we found that we had basically no recycling mechanism regarding rare earth. Then we came up with the idea of setting up a European rare earth competency network, bringing together people from research institutions, university, academics, industry, to work on this, to look into how technology could be developed in order to create new business cases. That worked for about 3 years, came up with conclusions. Some of it has been followed up on by the Commission, but that is an approach that we can take instead of just waiting until somehow the export streams are reversed or trying to close the borders. We could try to create new business models on the basis of new technologies that would create an attractiveness for the business to stay here. And the second approach is, and this is something that Umicore has pushed a lot in the past, that we could cooperate. Why do we of necessity believe that circularity ends at Europe's borders? There could be circularity in cooperation with some African Union countries. And indeed, we have had conferences here and in Addis in the past looking into this, how we could close the loop by teaming up with them and creating cooperative opportunities for business.
So taking it beyond Europe's borders in a sense, because it is actually a global market at the end of the day.
Right.
Okay. I'll bring it over to this side as well. Yves, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, indeed, because it was, I mean, it's a very wide question, and it was clearly on the table last year when we were also negotiating the waste legislation and the 6 directives that were changed. And the outcome was that there wasn't the political will to change that part enough to close the borders and keep all the secondary raw material within Europe's borders. So that's the political situation. The question is, what are the other mechanisms we can use? As we heard, new technologies, innovation. I didn't comment before on green public procurement, but of course we need the private sector to push forward on sustainable procurement, but we can lead the way also from the national government's perspective. We can create that demand because it is the pricing issue a lot. So it's a tricky thing that we need to figure out. It's true.
Not an easy one to solve, but a necessary one. Okay, we've got any further questions to pose to our speakers here? Yes, please.
Just adding on this one, because I mean, closing the border indeed might be difficult because on the other side, we are also importing materials into Europe. So if we close the border on our side and we know the game from the US and so on, I don't think it's a good way to start collaboration. But what we can do, and this already is, we have in our directives, in the WE directive, also in other directives, there's a link to equivalent conditions under which materials are recycled. And so I come back to my point from the first panel. If we really insist on that certain standards are met, then we don't have to close the border. We just need to put auditing systems in place and have to make sure that wherever the material is treated, it's surely, securely treated under the standards we define in Europe as good standards. But this equivalent condition, this is floating around the discussion since years, and it's not moving at all. So maybe we can speed up on this a bit.
Well, we had an in-depth discussion on it last year. So indeed, there is equivalent measures in one of the directives. There's broadly equivalence in the others. We looked into it in detail with the Parliament, with all the member states, with the Commission, and as of this year, this is the current outcome. But obviously, I mean, countries will need to look into where they're sending their secondary raw material, and we need to keep an eye on what's happening in Asia because obviously things are changing quickly. First things go to one country, then they find the waste from somewhere else. Now other countries are going to implement measures and change their policies. It's a constantly changing environment, so many things to keep an eye on.
Okay. Right, we've got ourselves about 5 more minutes on this panel to discuss. We've been talking in 2 ways at the moment. We've been talking broadly in terms of large visions, and we've also been touching across, quite naturally, some more concrete things. But let's bring it down now to the short term. The term political will, lack of political will, is a recurring theme in the discussions today. It's understandable. It would be. So there are a certain amount of visions or longer-term things that require political will, and in some cases it's currently not there. despite efforts of a presidency, efforts of a commission, efforts of the parliament, efforts of industry or efforts of others. So let's draw our attention now to what could be considered low-hanging fruit. What are the priority things in the short term we can do to really try and bridge this gap, if you like, this silo that we have between circular economy and low-carbon 2050 goals that we have at a European level? Ryan, I'll ask you to kick us off. If you had to recommend one or two things, what would they be? What's the immediate first steps to take now?
Going by the list that we saw of 5 priority recommendations, I would prioritize, number 1, procurement. Obviously not only targeting the public sector, but also the business sector. And I would prioritize eco-design. From my point of view, on both of these issues, we have had extensive discussions in the past. The matter is settled on a theoretical, on a visionary level. It's now about implementation. And if the will is missing at one point, there's always this famous dictum of Al Gore that political will is a renewable resource.
You do come out with some very good quotes, Ryan, I have to say. Wonderful. Thanks very much.
I hope that one day you will quote me.
Maybe we already have on Twitter as you were speaking. Actually, I know we have. Anyway, so for you, procurement and eco-design then, from Jelna's 5 that he proposed, and the ones we've discussed will be a top priority. Okay, yeah, what about for you?
I agree to that. I mean, looking at the 5 priorities we saw, and they got the most of the votes at the end of the day. But it remains a long-term element. I think this is not going to change overnight. So we have still, we touched it a bit. We are talking a lot about recycling materials. That's perfect. But we will not make it just by recycling. Let's be honest on that. Let's be clear on that. The next decades, we are going to be still using a substantial amount of primary material. So a balanced approach for primary and recycling material is needed. And let's see what happens then in 30, 40 years from now. Energy, we have a system in there that needs to be protected. I think carbon leakage is of importance. It was addressed from this morning. It's one of our main cost elements in there. And unfortunately, recycling and complex recycling goes with most of the time CO2 intensive activities. So energy is also a key element that we need to secure for the future. We had some topics about conflicting policies. We still believe they are there, like with REACH and the things that we do, where we can still, I think, get closer to each other and get a further alignment between the both of us. That's clear for us.
Okay, thanks. And Eve, over to you.
Okay, so I understand we talk about short term, we talk about, let's say, next mandate for the Commission, for example. We already had the specific ideas what could be done in practice, but I will just bring in 3 main decisions that will be taken in the short term that will literally define what we have to do and will give some mechanisms how we can do it. So first one is the EU long-term strategy that will be out soon. I'm sure heavy negotiations coming up next year, but we will have an outcome on this in the next couple of years, and the picture will be clear, and that will set the future. Another very important element is the discussions on the multi-annual financial framework, MFF, how much, climate mainstreaming clearly is on the table, very closely linked with circular economy because of the way circular economy contributes to that. So getting things right there, also very important. And the third and last that also has now come up several times is really getting things right in the sustainable financing taxonomy so that we can really use it the right way and we can channel the financing to where we really need to use it when we have the long-term vision. So all these decisions, major decisions taken within a few years that will be there for years to come.
Okay, thanks. Very clear. And since we started with you, I think it's circular to finish with you, isn't it? I've been waiting to say that for about 20 minutes, everybody. Sorry.
And there we are.
So there we go. Let's close the loop. Okay?
Maybe two remarks. One on breaking down the silos. I think that's also what you see very much in the climate community. That the way we look at economies and the greenhouse gas emissions is per sector, per source. Not trying to fully understand how these sectors are interrelated, what societal needs they serve, how these can be met with differently, for example. And I now see sort of also gradually, not in the Netherlands alone, but also in other countries, in Slovenia, that in UK, that the approach to look at the full metabolism and take an integrated approach to understanding an economy or understanding what materials flow through a region is certainly gaining traction. So I think that's the first step towards breaking down the silos, which we've already taken. The other thing is perhaps a silo which we at Circular Economy stepped into last year, because you saw what was the centerfold, this big Sankey diagram, which is essentially the mass flow through our global economy. Also, that is a silo, because it looks at mass only. And we're now working on a second edition of the GAP report. We're also going to look at, well, essentially draw that same picture, but then also look at value and carbon. And I think with that, we can probably come to better informed conclusions on where the potential really lies.
So you see that shift from measuring in mass to measuring in
also
carbon?
In value and carbon, because what you see, if you look at mass, then the biggest chunk, so the big blue part in the top, that's minerals going into the construction sector, but it's not necessarily where most of the value is, and that's the kind of also things we need to look into. So when you look at value, it's the capital goods sector, for example, that becomes way more important rather than the construction sector. I think it's these dimensions that we also need to understand.
Okay. Right, on that note then, I'm going to bring this panel to a close. So can we have a round of applause for our panellists, please? Thank you. We're 4 steps out of 5 now, ladies and gentlemen, and lunch is fast approaching, but we have some value to do before lunch, trust me. So, Floris, do you want to show us what you've been doing when we've been doing, please? We've got to have a look and see what Floris has come up with. I'm curious, ladies and gentlemen, to see what he's got. I'm very curious to see what he's got. Are you curious to see what he's got? I can usually buy about 15 seconds like that. Here we go. Oh, yes. Break the silos indeed. Yeah. Hopefully that's not a future we have to deal with, ladies and gentlemen. We know which one that's from, don't we? Yeah, definitely. Is that the lot, Floris? Thanks very much. Can we give him a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen? Practical thing, the presentations that you saw to open up today, the presentation that you saw here in relation to this report and its recommendations, the presentation you're about to see to close our day, and the cartoons will be, you can see many of them on Twitter. I think there'll be a gallery on the Eurometaux website at some point. Our speakers will receive copies of cartoons, of course, speakers. And you can download the presentations, or you'll receive, all of you registered here for today's event will receive today's presentations via email from the Eurometaux office, just to let you know, as a follow-up to your registration for today's event, okay? So now, if I could ask you all to sit yourselves down, I shall remain for just 1 second, and I shall take our last of 5 steps. And I'm going to call up Yanis Potočnik to the stage to give us his closing on today's event. So, do you want to come on up? Yeah. Do you want to join me?
Sure.
The clicker's here.
Yeah.
You've got your mic. I shall clear away my things, and I shall give the spotlight to you, sir.
Thanks. If we can put the presentation on, thanks a lot. Before, by the way, it was an excellent panel. I really enjoyed. Normally, I'm not many times sitting on that side, which is unfortunate. But I just want, before starting, I would just like to say a few words about the world in which we are living, because it's pretty essential that we understand what are the challenges which we are facing. In 4 years, we will have on the planet additional population of United States of America. 8 people own the same as the poorest half of the population. In 1 minute, we are buying 1 million plastic bottles globally. Half of the cities which will exist in 2050 have not yet been built. And if you want what is happening in the area of technological development, in 1997, Garry Kasparov was beaten in the second attempt by the computer, but the computer was entirely programmed by humans. Last year, Kiji, the world champion in Go, which is a more complicated game, was beaten while the only thing which was given to computer was the data. He learned that the game, he understood the rules, and he beat the human champion. So that's the era in which we are living. One of the major problems why the things are not changing faster than actually we would like to, it's basically captured in that slide. It's a quote from Jim Morrison from Doors, "People are strange." And the reason is that we all want changes, but we really don't want to change. So one thing which we really need to take into account that we understand that the world in which we are living today, it's entirely different than it was just a generation or two ago. A generation ago, my father was still using a horse to go to the next city. That was 20 kilometers from the small town when I was born. Today, we are, for the first time, living in a socio-economic society of planetary scope. So we are all interconnected and interdependent, which means that our individual and collective responsibility has enormously increased. The Club of Rome has nicely captured that in this slide, which is saying that the world has moved from so-called empty world, which was dominated by natural resources, nature, to a so-called full world, which is dominated by humans. While in the empty world, the labor and infrastructure were the limiting factors of human well-being, now it is the natural resources and environmental things which are the limiting factors of our development and our well-being. So you have heard also now in the panel, but one of the things which I think it's important really that we understand is that this is the way how normally the science works when it tries to explain something which is connected to environmental conclusions. So we look to D, DPSIR means D for drivers, P for pressures, S for state, I for impact, and R for responses. We normally look to the state and impact, to the climate change, to biodiversity loss, to the pollution which we are causing. But immediately when we would say, what are the reasons? What are actually the drivers? We talk about humans and economics and us. Why that's important? Because the responses are different. Because the policy measures are different. If I give you just one example, one of the political issues which Europe today is dealing with predominantly is migration, as you know, which is, of course, the impact and state. And we are dealing with it that we are discussing either we should build higher walls inside Europe, outside Europe, at the Schengen border, putting more security at the entrance of the doors, and we believe that this is the answer which will bring us the real solutions. Unfortunately, it will not. So if I would paraphrase the American President Trump, then our approach would need to be Africa first, which basically it's leading you to the drivers and pressures. And if you deal with that, believe me, you will not solve the situation. And in many cases, in environment, it's the same. That's why the focus on the ways we produce and consume, the focus on our economy, it's pretty much essential. So let us look to our economy. These are the signals which we are, it's a bit simplified, but it's not far from the truth. These are the signals which we are sending on the market. So in a way, financial capital, it's overvalued and over-rewarded. Human capital, it's undervalued and under-rewarded. And natural capital, it's not valued and not rewarded at all. So that comes to the markets, where producers and consumers apparently act rationally, and then we are surprised that we are living in economic model where we see imbalances in economy, in social world, and also, of course, in environmental part. In a way, it's a kind of recognition that market is working because the signals which we are sending are terribly wrong. You talked about before about the procurement. I can continue with subsidies. You can go to the tax structures and so on. Until the finance ministers will understand that their major job is keeping the budget in balance, we will have a problem. Because their actual major job is what incentives they are giving to the rest of the economies, how the economies are, they are moving. So that's how the situation should look. Safe operating space, where economic system would be the function of the ecosystems. And the major problem in that picture is, of course, environmental externalities. Many times when I was a commissioner that we cannot introduce that and that measure because it's causing additional costs for the business sector. That's, of course, under assumption that that costs are not existing already, but they are existing. They are either paid by the health system or we have simply indebted ourselves and they will be paid by the next generations. This is the easiest because the next generations cannot complain and we are not very well defending their interests. So in many cases, we are going as far to privatize the profits and to social costs. If we would look to the figure which is showing you different kind of measurement, we typically use for economic development the measurement of GDP, gross domestic product. And if we would look to the global economy figures for the last 20 years, actually it's 1990, 2010, we would see that we were solidly growing. But if we would add the costs of capital and social, which are measured in Human Development Index, Genuine Progress Indicator, Inclusive Wealth Index, each one is taking a bit of different angle, but the message is pretty much the same. We haven't grown a lot, or at least the growth is not identified exactly as it should be, and in the past were not good growth. There was also the bad growth, because it was causing more costs for future generations than actually the profits for us currently. So the conclusion from that would be, it's not helping if you are walking faster, if you are walking in the wrong direction. And that's unfortunately too many times the case. But let's move to something which looks much better. That is the commitment which we have all done, because Sustainable Development Goals should be understood as a kind of global social contract among all of us, understanding that we are doing the things in a wrong way and that we are ready to move in different direction. When in the International Resource Panel we have analyzed those things, the conclusion that the trade-offs among 17 goals, I think, is pretty straightforward. And that the best way, if you want to minimize those trade-offs and mitigate them, it's actually going the way of sustainable consumption and production, which means focusing a lot on the goal number 12, because if you really want to eradicate poverty, number 1, zero hunger, number 2, without changing the essence of the economics and distribution, this will simply not be possible. So it's pretty much an underlining condition if we are serious about developing the Sustainable Development Goals. Resources were, in many cases in the past, the so-called missing link. If we would look just from the point of European Union and European Union competitiveness angle, then it's not difficult to see that when it comes to fuels and mining products, we are importing much more than we are exporting. So that's the yellow part on the screen. And I still remember that this was from the European Commission 2014, that for 54 scarce and economically important raw materials, Europe, it's actually importing more than 90% of those. So we are vulnerable. And if nothing more, the prices are quite volatile on the international market. But even more interestingly, these are the data. It's about outdated, but it doesn't matter because the message is still the same. It's from the VDI, German Agency for Material Efficiency. The share, there are two major costs in any manufacturing company. One are costs related to labor, and another are costs related to materials. But the share of labor in 20 years decreased from 27 to 17, and the share of resources materials increase from 37 to 47. So it is pretty obviously, even if we look from a pure competitiveness perspective of European Union, where our focus should go in the future. And by the way, if we cut on resources, they will not go on the street and protest like it would be the case with labor. So one of the intellectual thing which we are following in the International Resource Panel is basically that human well-being should grow faster than economic activity, but economic activity should absolutely be decoupled from resource decoupling, and both should be decoupled from the impacts, environmental and health impacts. When I was still at the university, we were teaching, and I was, by the way, the modeler, and whenever we were lacking the data of GDP, we used the data of material consumption or normally the energy consumption, which is exactly where is the problem. So you need to decouple the things, and they shouldn't go hand in hand because this is creating the real pressure. That's a quite interesting conclusion from the IRP, which is dealing with resources, that in the midterm, actually, the shortage of resources, except in specific cases, will not be the real game changer of our consumption and production. But the environmental and health consequences caused by this irresponsible and excessive use of those resources will be. If I translate you that in a human language, China closed more than 2,000 companies around Beijing some years ago. This was not because those companies were running short of any materials, any resources. It was because the use of those resources in those companies was causing pollution, which forced the government to close the factories. So that's actually the driver of today's change. It's pretty much the things which we are seeing in climate change, in the biodiversity loss, in pollution, and I can continue. So that's the picture which normally is the picture of how we address the problems in the climate change. So it's more the supply side angle. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, and management of the carbon. These are the predominant things which we are addressing. By the way, when in my times in the Commission, the energy sector and the climate sector were brought together, it was a major revolution because we broke the silos. But today, keeping them together, it's becoming a major silos because it's staying here with the solutions predominantly. And I think it's pretty important that we understand that we should connect that with the coupling of land, water, materials. If you would for a second just imagine the world in which you have abundant energy, cheap energy, all renewable energy, but existing model of consumption and production, and the growing population as we are seeing, we haven't really dealt with the issue of the climate change. Yes, we have dealt with an important issue, but a lot of the burden would be simply shifted to the rest of the economy, and we would deal with other problems elsewhere. So in essence, I do believe that even that is not enough. I think there are three pillars where you need to combine the policies. One is the known supply side, energy carbon management. The second is demand side solutions, circular economy, land, water, materials management. And the third, which we should add, it's nature-based solutions, where you look to the ecosystem services, where you look to environmental things. And only if you combine these three policies, you get the real answer to the climate change. If you stay only on the supply side, you get frustrated because you don't see the way out. That's the problem. And in many times, you even come to wrong conclusions. So it's really essential that you broaden your picture. If we look a bit to these demand-side solutions and how this is connected, because it was already mentioned at the beginning by you about material economics, these are the data which we have. I was in the steering committee of that, and these are the data where we look to the plastic, aluminium, steel, and cement. The baseline, it's actually including already the energy solutions. And you can cut more than half, as you have already seen on your slide before, still the CO2 emissions if you go to the circular economy. And if you look at it through the perspective, for example, of changing the business model of owing the cars to the sharing, so this is typical circular economy approach, then the CO2 impacts of materials could be 70% less, the total cost of ownership for us, consumers, could be 77% less, and externalities and costs to society would be 74% less. If I finally share you some conclusions which were done also by International Resource Panel about resource efficiency for the G7 and G20, we have done a model in which we compared the existing trends, then only using the resource efficiency policies, only using the climate policies, and then combining the resource and climate policies. And when you look to the global resource use, so to the use of materials, you see if you combine the both policies, pretty attractive outcome. When you look it to the greenhouse gas emissions, again, you find the same results. And particularly interesting is when you look to the GDP, to economic activity. If you use only climate policies, actually you are endangering the economic development. Immediately when you combine that also with the resource efficiency policies, you get pretty much more positive result. Circular economy, very quickly, and the next steps where we would be going. As you know, it started as an environment initiative, what I mentioned. Then it was transformed to an economic-based initiative with positive environmental health consequences. And what would be really needed and how we should look at it would be that it's part of the bigger picture of the societal and cultural transformation which is needed to sustain the humanity and its prosperity. So where would our focus should be in the next steps of the circular economy development? All the concrete things which were mentioned before in your table were absolutely going in the right direction. What I would add is, add the social aspects, because if you will not add, don't dream about making this model global, because the others are not dealing with the same questions as we are dealing. And they should understand that this is not another Western type of the model which we want to spread over the world, but we care for their growth and we care for their employment. Second, retaining value in the circular economy, so making the model such that they would themselves economically, that economic motor would actually run more in the same direction as the regulation it's currently running. Then sustainable financing will be crucial. Link it to the digital transformation as necessary enablers of the circular economy. Go to something like a roadmap for the digital circularity. It would be super for both sides to see how they nicely fit together and how they actually work. And of course, link circular economy to climate change, to bioeconomy, to the urban systems where the majority of the things are happening. All that is relatively easy, and majority of that is from the breaking silos approach. And then, because if we stay only with our philosophy, looking to eco-design, looking to those which are in our hands, we will again be in our silos, as you mentioned. So I think it's pretty essential that we try to broaden those who understand and see that we actually talk about the social transformation in which they have the role to play, because without them we will simply not succeed. So this is the European Union 2018 action plan. You know it well, so I will not, but the only thing which was also mentioned by the Estonian colleague, one of the things which is really important is that currently we are in the middle of MFF. And why this is so important? Because Agenda for Sustainable Development is 2030. And MFF, it's 21, 27, very likely. So there will be no other MFF. If this one will not succeed, we will fail. So basically the conclusion is, if this will not be done, I have to return to my favorite band. The time is gone, the song is over, thought I have something more to say. So that will be, unfortunately, our problem. So to conclude, new economic model based on sustainable consumption and production, integrating all three pillars of sustainability, it's simply necessary and unavoidable. And changing the compass which is orientating us, it's necessary because our current compass is broken. You talked also on the previous session, until all actors in the business sector will mainly understand the risk management, be it a farmer, be it somebody in your factory, or be it in the financial sector. The risk management, it's managing their profits. Until that time, we will have the real problem. Because they need to understand that they are integral part of the society and they need to manage their own risks, but at the same time, we have to collectively manage also the risk of the society. That's the conclusion which was reached by the World Economic Forum, that the major economic body, that the complexity and scale of these challenges requires new forms of collaboration and more systemic approaches, and that the challenge seems not to be any more inadequate scientific evidence, but rather a cooperation and implementation. And there is a deepening perception of a lack of synchronicity between economic and environmental policy responses to global risks. I firmly believe that we have no different choice than cooperating more globally. Actually, I said here redefining sovereignty, which means that the best model which we can see is actually European Union, because some decades ago we have decided that for the purpose to avoid wars and conflicts, we will cooperate. We have today many, many problems, and sometimes some things like Brexit are going exactly in the wrong direction, as it should. But still, we have to admit that the European project, from the point of view why we have built it, it's extremely successful. So I'm a bit worried, really, that if we don't understand that with all the challenges which we are facing, with how the world stands, where we go, if we don't understand that we need to cooperate and listen to each other more, we have an alternative, which is basically conflicts and wars. So let's be serious about implementing what we have agreed in SDGs if we want to avoid that. Changes are unavoidable and humans are supposed to be intelligent, and it's high time to prove it. Change will not appear by waiting for the leadership of others. Be the leader on your level of governance, authority, politics, business, academia, civil society, making your investment decisions. Finally, I think that the circular economy genie is out of the bottle, and many of the companies are already seeing, including yourself, where you have to go. By the way, the strategic thinking is developed in the business sector than it's actually developed in the public sector. I can say that pretty clearly because I was part of national government for quite some years, and 10 years also the member of European government. And we haven't had really a lot, if any, strategic debates. So circular economy connects competitiveness and sustainability. It's about transition to a SDG-compliant economy, and for me, the major question is really how to overcome short-termism inbuilt in our democratic political systems and institutions, public financial, which is in fundamental conflict with the system change needed. So I will be finishing also with two quotes, which are, one is from the quote of the person which you have already heard today, that's Albert Einstein. Will that be easy? When he was asked why it is that mankind has stretched so far as to discover the structure of the atom, but we have not been able to devise the political means to keep the atom from destroying us, he replied, "That's simple, my friend, it's because politics is more difficult than physics." That story which I have shared with you, the story in which you think and talk about, it's a lot the story of physics, because in certain way, us humans are denying the physical laws. And the story of the solutions, it's in the hands of us humans, in political hands. And if we don't take it seriously, then unfortunately, we will see it in hard way how to change. And for those who still doubt why this side of the story, connecting environment and health to economics, it's important. It's a very good quote from Professor McPherson from Arizona University in the United States. He was saying, if you think the economy is more important than environment and health, try holding your breath while counting your money. So that would be all. I would like to thank you for your attention and also for keeping your flags high when it comes to changing economic systems. Thank you.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to bring things to a close. There's a lunch waiting for you if you go out the door. You keep going out the door until you can go no further than through the next door, and you'll find the buffet lunch that the organisers have very kindly put on for you. I'd like to say 3 things to conclude, and they will take about 90 seconds. I don't think at this stage of the day you need 20 minutes of conclusion from me. You've captured the key points you've captured today. We've heard also from our final speaker a number of key observations echoing points we've heard throughout the day about cooperation, about synergy, about gaps, about change of approach, about industry doing its part but needing to be met part of the way by policymakers. And we've heard too many times for my taste, but you tell me about yours, lack of political will. Well, we need more political will then to match the will of industry to get things done. So my conclusion is this. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope you found it fruitful, useful. I hope it was half a day well spent. And last but not least, enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. No, I was pleased with that. Yeah, I thought we did well.
I think the debate, from what I heard during the